The rhythmic shush-shush of the mop against the linoleum was the only thing keeping Samuel Whitmore grounded. It was a simple task, a meditative erasure of footprints and spills that required nothing from the brilliant, scarred mind he had tried so hard to put to sleep. But tonight, the hospital's sterile peace was shattered. The automatic double doors of the emergency department hissed open, admitting a blast of cold air and the frantic shouting of paramedics. Male, 45, blunt force trauma to the chest, falling blood pressure, breath sounds absent on the left. Dr. Eris Thorne, a senior resident known more for his expensive watch than his diagnostic accuracy, stepped into the path of the gurney. Tension pneumothorax, Thorne declared, his voice full of the unearned confidence of a man who had never seen a battlefield. Get him to trauma 2. We'll prep for a standard chest tube. Samuel stopped mopping. He stood 10 feet away, a shadow in dark blue coveralls, leaning slightly on his mop handle. His eyes, usually clouded with a self-imposed dullness, sharpened with a terrifying precision. He didn't look at the patient's face. He looked at the distension of the neck veins and the subtle, paradoxical movement of the abdominal wall. It's not a pneumothorax, Samuel said. The voice was quiet, raspy from disuse, but it carried through the chaotic room like a low-frequency hum. Thorne froze, his hand mid-air as he reached for a pair of gloves. He turned, eyes narrowing as they landed on the man with the mop. Excuse me? Thorne snapped. Whitmore, right? Did the floor wax fumes get to your head? Get back to the hallway. You're tracking water into a sterile zone. Samuel didn't move. He didn't even blink. Look at the trachea, he said, his deadpan expression immovable. It's not shifting. The muffled heart sounds and the narrowing pulse pressure, it's a pericardial tamponade. There's blood in the sac around the heart. If you shove a chest tube in there, you're going to drop his pressure to 0. He'll be dead before you hit the pleural space. A heavy silence fell over the trauma bay. The nurses paused, their hands hovering over force starts and cardiac monitors. For a fleeting second, the sheer authority in Samuel's voice, the clinical coldness of a man who had performed thousands of surgeries under mortar fire, held them captive. Then, the laughter started. It began with Thorne, a sharp, derisive snort. A pericardial tamponade? You've been watching too many medical dramas on your break, Sam. You're a janitor. You empty the red bags. You don't diagnose the patients. Dr. Thorne, the BP is dropping. A nurse called out, her voice tight with worry. 80/40. See? Thorne sneered at Samuel. Pressure's dropping because the lung is collapsing. Get out of here, Whitmore. Now. Samuel watched as Thorne grabbed a large bore needle. The resident was moving fast, driven by ego and the need to prove the janitor wrong. If you do that, Samuel said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding less like a janitor and more like a judge, you are committing medical malpractice. He doesn't have a collapsed lung. He has a ticking bomb in his chest. That's enough, Thorne yelled. Security! Get this man out of my sight! He's interfering with a life-saving procedure. 2 security guards moved in, grabbing Samuel by the shoulders. He didn't resist. He went limp, his eyes fixed on the patient with a look of profound, weary sadness. He had seen this movie before. He had seen the arrogance of the learned kill the innocent. As they dragged him toward the exit, Samuel caught a glimpse of the cardiac monitor. The heart rate was climbing, a desperate, final gallop. Check the ultrasound. Samuel called back one last time, a ghost of a plea in his voice. Just 5 seconds with the probe. It'll save his life. Thorne didn't even look up. He positioned the needle over the patient's ribs. Janitor talk, he muttered to the nurses, aiming to reclaim his status. Next time, tell HR to vet the cleaning staff for mental stability. Samuel was pushed through the swinging doors, the mop left behind on the floor like a discarded weapon. He stood in the quiet hallway, his hands, the hands of the professor, shaking with a suppressed, violent urge to save a man he knew was about to die. He looked at the clock. The patient had 3 minutes. And in the distance, far above the city skyline, the low, rhythmic throb of a heavy-lift helicopter began to vibrate in the glass of the hospital windows. The military was coming. But for the man in trauma 2, it was already too late. The security guards didn't just escort Samuel. They marched him toward the administrative wing like a prisoner of war. The grip on his bicep was tight enough to bruise, but Samuel barely felt it. His mind was still back in trauma 2, calculating the seconds. 120 seconds until the pericardial sac fills. 90 seconds until the heart can no longer expand to beat. He was shoved into a sterile, glass-walled office that smelled of expensive cologne and cold coffee. Behind a mahogany desk sat Marcus Vane, the floor supervisor. Vane was a man who lived for the hierarchy, a bureaucrat who viewed the hospital not as a place of healing, but as a machine of protocols and power dynamics. "Sit down, Whitmore," Vane commanded, not looking up from a file. Samuel remained standing. He looked at the clock on Vane's wall. 60 seconds. "I just received a very disturbing call from Dr. Thorne," Vane said, finally looking up. His face was flushed with a self-important rage. "He tells me you didn't just interfere with a trauma patient. You actively harassed a senior resident during a life-or-death procedure. You claim to know more than a board-certified physician?" "I claim to know the anatomy of the heart," Samuel said, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. "Because I do. Thorne is about to kill that man." Vane let out a short, bark-like laugh. "Listen to yourself. You're a janitor, Samuel. You were hired out of charity because your references were vague, to say the least. We needed someone to handle the grit, not someone to play Dr. House. Do you have any idea how much liability you've just created for this institution? The liability is a corpse in trauma 2. Samuel countered. Check the monitors. Call the bay. If he's already inserted the chest tube, the patient is flatlining. Vane slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing off the glass. That is enough. Your delusions of grandeur end here. You aren't a doctor. You aren't even an orderly. You are a man who pushes a mop, and frankly, you've proven you can't even do that without causing a scene. He pulled a single sheet of paper from a drawer and signed it with a flourish. He shoved it across the desk. It was a formal termination notice for gross insubordination and endangering patient safety. You're finished, Whitmore. Hand over your badge. Security will escort you to your locker to collect your things, and then you are banned from these grounds. If I see your face near a patient again, I'll have you arrested for practicing medicine without a license. Samuel looked at the paper. It was a meaningless scrap of wood pulp compared to the weight of what was coming. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his plastic ID badge. He didn't drop it. He placed it precisely in the center of the termination notice. I'll leave, Samuel said softly. But when the chief of surgery asks why the patient died, tell him you chose the resident's ego over the janitor's eyes. Vane's face turned a deep shade of purple. Get him out of here. Now! As the guards turned Samuel around, the floor beneath their feet began to tremble. It started as a subtle vibration in the soles of their shoes, then escalated into a rhythmic, chest-thumping roar. The glass walls of Vane's office began to rattle in their frames. Vane looked toward the window, his anger replaced by confusion. What the hell is that? Construction? Samuel didn't need to look. He knew the sound of a GT700 engine. He knew the specific, aggressive pitch of a specialized Black Hawk. He turned his head slightly, catching the flash of strobe lights reflecting off the neighboring building. That's not construction, Samuel whispered, a cold, heavy realization settling in his gut. The ghost life he had built. The quiet, invisible existence of sweeping floors and being nobody was ending. The world he had fled was landing in the parking lot, and they weren't coming for the doctors. Vane was still shouting, demanding to know why the lights were flickering, but Samuel was already looking past him. He wasn't a janitor anymore. He was a man waiting for the inevitable moment the door would burst open and the hierarchy of St. Jude's would be burned to the ground. The roar was no longer a vibration, it was a physical assault. Outside the reinforced windows of the administrative wing, the night sky was swallowed by the belly of a MH6M little bird, its matte black skin absorbing the hospital's security lights. It hovered inches above the asphalt of the emergency bay's parking lot, the downdraft from its rotors turning the landscaped bushes into shredded green confetti, and sending a nearby trash bin tumbling like a toy. Inside the office, Marcus Vane was gripped by a sudden, frantic terror. He scrambled to the window, his termination notice forgotten on the desk. "Is this a terrorist attack? Why aren't the police here?" Samuel didn't answer. He stood with his arms at his sides, his posture slowly shifting. The hunch in his shoulders, the one he had cultivated for months to appear smaller and more invisible, began to dissolve. He stood at his full height, his eyes fixed on the glass doors of the lobby below. The helicopter hadn't even touched the ground before the fast ropes dropped. 4 figures in multicam fatigues, devoid of any patches or unit insignias, slid down with blurred speed. They hit the pavement in perfect tactical formation, suppressed carbines held at low ready. They didn't move like police. They moved like predators who owned the air they breathed. "They're heading for the entrance!" Vane shrieked, reaching for his desk phone. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling the National Guard." "Don't," Samuel said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command that stopped Vane's hand an inch from the receiver. Down in the lobby, the automatic doors struggled to open against the sheer force of the wind. When they finally slid back, the soldiers moved in a silent, synchronized sweep. They didn't shout for people to get down. They simply occupied the space, their presence an undeniable wall of steel. 2 men took the elevators, 2 took the stairs. The hospital's intercom system crackled to life, but it wasn't the usual, code blue, or paging Dr. Smith. A voice, gravelly and cold, cut through the speakers. "This is United States Joint Special Operations Command. We are declaring a state of medical emergency under Title 10 authority. All hospital personnel are to remain at their current stations. Do not interfere with our movement. We are here for an extraction and immediate surgical intervention." Vane turned toward Samuel, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Extraction? What are they talking about? We don't have anyone here." The heavy oak door to Vane's office didn't just open, it was kicked inward with enough force to crack the frame. A man in a dark tactical flight suit stepped in. He wasn't wearing a mask, revealing a face mapped with scars and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world and survived it. On his chest was a single word, Hayes. He didn't look at the security guards, who had instinctively drawn their batons. He didn't look at the trembling floor supervisor. His eyes locked onto the man in the dark blue coveralls. "Professor," Hayes said, his voice dropping the tactical edge for a tone of pure, desperate respect. Samuel sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of all the lives he had saved and lost. "I told you never to find me, Miller." "The vice president's son is in the back of that bird, Sam," Hayes said, stepping closer, ignoring Vane entirely. "Prototype fragmentation round in the subclavian artery. It's magnetic fused. Our medics can't touch it. The Surgeon General said there's only one man in the hemisphere who can perform a blind extraction without triggering the tremor sensor." Vane stepped forward, his ego making a final, pathetic stand. "Now see here. This man is a former employee. He's just been terminated for..." Hayes didn't even turn his head. He reached out, grabbed Vane by the tie, and pulled him within an inch of his scarred face. "This man," Hayes whispered, "is a national asset. If you speak again while I am talking to him, I will have you detained under the Patriot Act and flown to a black site you've never heard of. Do you understand?" Vane made a small, choking sound and nodded. Samuel looked out at the helicopter, then at his own hands, the hands that had been pushing a mop for 6 months. The shaking was gone. The stillness had returned. I need a titanium kit, Samuel said, his voice now the only one that mattered in the room. And I need trauma too. Empty. It's waiting for you, sir, Hayes said, stepping aside and snapping a crisp, sharp salute to the man in the janitor's jumpsuit. Samuel walked past the security guards, past the broken door, and toward the elevator. The ghost was gone. The professor had returned. The elevator doors slid open to a lobby that had been transformed into a tactical theater. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy thud of combat boots on tile. Nurses and residents were pressed against the walls, their hands raised or clutching clipboards like shields, as JSOC operators established a perimeter. Samuel stepped out, still clad in his dark blue coveralls, the heavy fabric stained with the floor wax and grime of his shift. Beside him, Commander Hayes walked a half-step behind, a position of clear subordination that did not go unnoticed by the gathered staff. Emerging from the crowd was Dr. Jonathan Victor, the chief of surgery. He was a man of immense stature in the medical community, a silver-haired titan who usually moved with an air of untouchable authority. Dr. Thorne was at his side, looking pale and frantic, gesturing toward the elevator. "Dr. Victor!" Thorne shouted, his voice cracking. "There he is!" "That's the janitor who interfered in trauma too. He's the reason for all this. He must have called these people. He's a security threat." Thorne's voice died in his throat as Samuel stopped in the center of the lobby. Dr. Victor didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at the armed soldiers or the helicopter idling outside. His eyes were locked on Samuel, widening with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a profound, visible relief. For a moment, the chief of surgery seemed to forget how to breathe. Then, to the absolute horror of Dr. Thorne and the collective gasp of the nursing staff, the most powerful man in the hospital did something unthinkable. Dr. Victor closed the distance, stopped 3 feet from the man in the jumpsuit, and lowered his head. Then, he bent at the waist, his white lab coat brushing his knees in a deep, formal, and submissive bow, the kind reserved for royalty or a master of the craft. "Professor Whitmore," Victor whispered, his voice trembling with reverence. "We thought you were dead. We thought the world had lost you in Zurich." The lobby went deathly silent. The only sound was the distant whine of the Black Hawk. "I wasn't dead, Jonathan," Samuel said, his voice regaining that terrifying, surgical resonance. "I was just tired of the noise." Thorne stumbled forward, his face a mask of confusion. "Chief? What are you doing?" This is Sam. He mops the floors. He's a nobody." Victor snapped upright, his eyes flashing with a cold fury that silenced Thorne instantly. "You arrogant fool," Victor hissed. "You are standing in the presence of the man who pioneered the very vascular techniques you spent 4 years failing to learn. He is a triple-boarded fellow of the Royal College, the former chief of trauma at Landstuhl, and the only man alive who has successfully operated on a live explosive. If he told you the sky was falling, you shouldn't look up, you should start digging a hole." Victor turned back to Samuel, his eyes pleading. "Professor, I've just seen the scans from trauma too." "Thorne." He inserted the tube. "The patient is in cardiac arrest." "It's exactly what you predicted." Samuel didn't waste time with, "I told you so." He didn't look at Thorne, who looked as though he might faint. Samuel simply looked at the clock. "Then we have 90 seconds, Samuel said. He looked at the chief of surgery. "I need your hands, Jonathan. But you will follow my lead. I am the primary. You are the scrub. Do you understand? It would be the greatest honor of my career." The chief of surgery replied, stepping back to let the janitor lead the way. Samuel began to walk, his stride long and purposeful. As he passed Thorne, he didn't stop, but his voice trailed behind him like a cold wind. "Clean up your mess, Thorne. Starting with my mop in the hallway." The staff parted like the Red Sea. The man in the blue coveralls didn't look like a janitor anymore. He looked like a king returning to a throne he had long ago vacated, and God help anyone who stood in his way. The transition from the lobby to the surgical suite was a blur of high-stakes motion. Samuel didn't run. He moved with a predatory economy of scale, every step calculated, every breath measured. Behind him, the chief of surgery and a phalanx of JSOC operators formed a wake of silent, grim determination that swept through the hospital corridors. When they reached the scrub sinks outside Trauma 2, Samuel stopped. With a sharp, practiced tug, he unzipped the dark blue coveralls. The garment that had defined his invisible life for 6 months pulled on the floor like a shed skin. Beneath it, he wore a simple charcoal t-shirt that clung to a frame hardened by years of field deployments. His forearms were a road map of old scars and steady muscle, a stark contrast to the soft, pampered hands of the residents who had mocked him. "Soap," Samuel commanded. A nurse, who only an hour ago had laughed at his janitor's advice, now scrambled to activate the sensor. Samuel began the surgical scrub, his movements rhythmic and violent, scouring his skin until it was raw. He didn't look at his own reflection in the mirror. He looked at Dr. Victor, who was scrubbing beside him in stunned silence. "Jonathan, listen carefully," Samuel said, his voice dropping into the resonant, instructional tone that had once commanded lecture halls in Zurich and medical tents in Fallujah. "The JSOC team is bringing in a patient with a live, magnetic fused ordnance in the subclavian. This isn't just a surgery, it's an EOD operation. If a single piece of ferrous metal, a needle, a scalpel, even a stray staple, gets within 6 inches of that wound, this entire floor becomes a crater." Dr. Victor paused, his hands dripping with foam. "Professor, our standard kits are all stainless steel. We don't have—" "I know what you don't have," Samuel interrupted, stepping back as a tech held out a sterile gown. He plunged his arms into the sleeves. "That's why Hayes is bringing the titanium field kit from the bird. You will use nothing else. If you drop a tool, you leave it. Do not reach for the back table. Do not look at the monitors. Look at me." Samuel stepped into the OR. The room was a chaotic mess left behind by Dr. Thorne. Blood on the floor, a discarded chest tube tray, and a patient whose heart had stopped. Thorne was still there, frozen in the corner, his face a mask of ashen terror. "Out," Samuel said. Thorne blinked, his voice a pathetic squeak. "But I'm the attending." "You are a liability," Samuel said, not even looking at him as he snapped on his gloves. The sound of the latex meeting his wrists was like a gunshot in the silent room. "Commander Hayes, remove this man. If he tries to re-enter, treat him as a hostile." 2 soldiers moved with terrifying efficiency, lifting Thorne by his elbows and removing him from the room before he could utter another word. The doors hissed open again as a tactical gurney was wheeled in. On it lay a young man, his face pale as marble, a jagged piece of blackened metal protruding from just beneath his collarbone. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, charged with the invisible threat of the explosive. "Seal the room," Samuel ordered. "Level for biohazard protocols. No one in or out until I say so." He stepped up to the table, the overhead surgical lights catching the intensity in his eyes. He felt the weight of the scalpel in his hand, not a standard hospital tool, but a titanium blade brought from the helicopter. For the first time in half a year, the janitor was gone. The professor stood at the head of the table, his hands perfectly still, his mind a cold, crystalline machine. "All right, Jonathan," Samuel said, his gaze fixed on the wound. "Let's see if you remember anything I taught you in '09. Scalpel. Suction. And tell the nurses to start the bypass. We're going in blind." The room settled into a high-tension silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the life support and the quiet, steady breathing of a man who had finally come home. The air in the operating room felt thick, almost electric. It wasn't just the tension of a failing heart. It was the presence of the negative for Malawin Quach's fragmentation round. Every person in the room breathed in a shallow, synchronized rhythm, as if a sudden exhale might trigger the magnetic sensor buried in the soldier's chest. Samuel stood over the open wound, his eyes scanning the anatomy with a depth of field that surpassed the surgical monitors. He wasn't looking at just tissue and bone. He was looking at the fluid dynamics of a dying man. "The alloy in this casing isn't standard," Samuel said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the silence. "The military calls it smart frag. It's designed to detonate it when it detects the specific magnetic signature of surgical steel. If we had used your standard hospital kit, Jonathan, we'd all be memories by now." Dr. Victor wiped sweat from his brow, his hands steady only because Samuel was there. "How do you know the trigger thresholds, Professor? This tech was classified as of 6 months ago." "I didn't just read about it," Samuel replied, his titanium forceps hovering millimeters from the subclavian artery. "I designed the stabilization protocols for the research team before I left the program. They called it the Whitmore variance. It was a theoretical solution to a wound that was supposed to be fatal. Today, it stops being theoretical." The room grew colder as Samuel signaled for the bypass. He was about to perform a blind, cold clamp maneuver, a technique he had outlined in a secret paper that the medical board had once dismissed as surgically impossible. He had to manually reroute the blood flow through the artery using only tactile feedback, all while keeping the live ordnance perfectly still. "Bypass active," the tech whispered. "Dropping core temperature," Samuel commanded. "I need the heart to slow to a crawl. I'm going to enter the pocket behind the shard." He moved. It was a dance of microscopic precision. His fingers, once covered in the grime of a janitor's work, were now instruments of pure genius. He slid a titanium ribbon beneath the artery, the metal silent and non-reactive. The monitors began to whine, a high-pitched, frantic warning. "The sensor is active," Hayes warned from the corner of the room, his hand hovering over his own comms. "Professor, the round is sensing the blood flow change. It's arming." "Quiet," Samuel said. The word wasn't a request, it was an absolute. He closed his eyes. To the stunned nurses and the chief of surgery, it looked like he had given up. In reality, Samuel was visualizing the three-dimensional map of the soldier's chest. He felt the vibration of the round through the tips of his forceps. He could feel the hum of the electronic fuse. He waited for the exact millisecond between heartbeats, the moment of maximum stillness. With a flick of his wrist that was too fast for the human eye to follow, he applied the titanium clamp and slid a specialized non-ferrous mesh over the sensor's eye. The frantic whining of the monitor stopped instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. "Vascular bridge is secure," Samuel announced, his voice devoid of triumph, sounding only of clinical exhaustion. "The round is isolated. Jonathan, take the suction. Clear the field so I can see the seat of the fuse. We're halfway home." Dr. Victor stared at the monitor, then at Samuel. He had just witnessed a miracle performed by a man the hospital had tried to fire an hour ago. "Professor," Victor whispered, "that maneuver, it's not in any manual." "It is now," Samuel said, his eyes never leaving the wound. "Keep your focus. If we slip now, the bypass fails, and he bleeds out in seconds. Let's finish this." Outside the pressurized glass of the observation gallery, the world of the hospital hierarchy had begun to crumble. Dr. Eris Thorne stood pressed against the pane, his hands white-knuckled as they gripped the railing. Beside him, the junior janitor who had spent the morning mocking Samuel's missed spots, stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in a silent, hollow expression of shock. From this vantage point, they didn't see the man who pushed a mop. They saw a god of the theater. Below them, Samuel moved with a fluidity that was haunting to watch. He had shed the clumsy persona of the janitor, as completely as he had shed the blue coveralls now lying in a heap in the corner. Every gesture he made was a masterclass in economy and intent. He wasn't just performing surgery, he was conducting a symphony of high-stakes survival. The junior janitor, whose name was Kevin, felt a cold, sinking weight in his stomach. He remembered, with excruciating clarity, how he had shoved a trash bin into Samuel's shins just 4 hours ago, laughing as he told him he was too slow to even be a garbage man. He watched as the chief of surgery, a man Kevin wasn't even allowed to look at, stood in a position of humble service, holding a retractor with the submissive focus of a first-year student. "That's not him," Kevin whispered, his voice cracking. "It can't be him." "It's him," Thorne replied, though the words sounded like they were being choked out of him. Thorne's soul-crushing realization was of a different, more professional nature. He watched as Samuel executed the Whitmore variants, a maneuver Thorne had once mocked in a medical journal as theoretical arrogance. He saw the way Samuel's hands, which he had claimed were unfit for sterile zones, held the titanium forceps with a stillness that defied human biology. Every second that passed was a testament to Thorne's own incompetence. He realized that the man he had called a diversity hire and a mental liability had actually been the only thing standing between him and a career-ending lawsuit. If Samuel hadn't intervened, that soldier would be a corpse, and Thorne would be in handcuffs. The gallery was crowded now. Other surgeons, nurses, and even the hospital board members had gathered in the shadows, watching in a stunned, reverent silence. They saw the JSOC commander, a man who looked like he could level a building with a glance, standing guard at the door, his eyes never leaving the back of the man in the surgical gown. Down in the pit, Samuel reached the critical moment. With a movement so delicate it seemed to happen in slow motion, he lifted the live fragmentation round from the soldier's chest. The red warning light on the EOD monitor flickered, then turned a steady, peaceful green. Samuel handed the explosive to a waiting tech with the same nonchalance he might have used to hand over a used paper towel. He didn't look up at the gallery. He didn't seek the approval of the titans of medicine watching him. To him, they were invisible. Thorne slumped against the glass, his forehead resting on the cold surface. He felt small. He felt insignificant. The janitor hadn't just saved a life, he had obliterated the carefully constructed world of ego that Thorne lived in. Kevin, the junior janitor, slowly backed away from the window. He looked at his own hands, then at the mop bucket standing in the hallway. He realized that for months, he had been bullying a lion, and the only reason he was still standing was because the lion hadn't felt like roaring. The silence in the gallery was absolute. Below them, the professor began the closing sutures, his hands moving with the grace of a weaver, leaving behind a perfect, surgical seam that would become the stuff of hospital legend. The hierarchy had been flipped upside down, and for those watching through the glass, the world would never look the same again. The heavy lead-lined doors of the operating room hissed open, and Samuel stepped out into the corridor. He was still wearing the surgical gown, now splattered with the evidence of a battle won, but he had already begun to peel the latex gloves from his fingers. The adrenaline that had sustained his steady hands was receding, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that felt like lead in his veins. Waiting in the hallway was a man who seemed to command the very air around him. He wasn't in tactical gear like Hayes. He wore the service dress blues of a rear admiral, the gold braid on his sleeves catching the harsh hospital light. Admiral Richard Vance stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable until he saw Samuel. Then, the stiff military posture softened into something resembling relief. "The round is out, Richard," Samuel said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't offer a salute, and the Admiral didn't seem to expect one. "The boy is stable. Victor is finishing the irrigation now." "I never doubted it, Sam," the Admiral replied. He gestured toward a quiet alcove away from the lingering, wide-eyed staff members who were still trying to process the night's events. "But we need to talk about what happens next. The ghost protocol is blown. You can't go back to the mop and the bucket. Not after tonight." Samuel leaned against the cold tile wall, looking down at his hands. They were still, but he felt the ghost of the tremor returning. "I like the mop, Richard. It didn't ask anything of me. It didn't have a pulse. When I finished a floor, it stayed clean." Vance stepped closer, his voice dropping to a persuasive, urgent tone. The world is getting darker, Sam. We have a seat waiting for you at the Bethesda Annex Director of Surgical Research and Field Operations. Your own lab, your own team, and a budget that doesn't exist on any public ledger. No more hiding in the shadows of a local hospital. We're offering you your throne back. You'd be the most powerful medical mind in the Department of Defense. Samuel looked through the glass of the nearby window. Outside, the Black Hawk was preparing for takeoff, its rotors beginning to blur into a halo of gray. He thought about the throne the Admiral was describing, the high-level briefings, the weight of 1,000 lives resting on his signature, the constant, suffocating pressure of being the professor. He thought about Marcus Vane's termination notice and Dr. Thorne's arrogance. He thought about the way the hospital staff had looked at him. First with contempt, then with terror, and finally with a worshipful awe that felt just as isolating as the mockery. You're offering me power, Samuel said quietly. But I've had power. It didn't stop the nightmares. It's not just about power, Vance countered. It's about duty. You're a national asset. You saw what happened tonight. Without you, that boy is dead. How many more boys are out there who need the Whitmore variants? Samuel turned his gaze back to the Admiral. For the first time, the deadpan, stoic mask flickered. There was a spark of something new in his eyes, not the desire for a throne, but a realization of a different kind of duty. You're right about one thing, Richard, Samuel said. I can't go back to being a janitor. But I'm not going back to Bethesda either. I'm tired of being an asset. I think it's time I tried being a teacher. The Admiral frowned, confused by the shift. A teacher? In what capacity? Samuel looked toward the OR, where the junior residents were hovering, watching the closing of the patient with the intensity of people who had just realized how little they actually knew. The hierarchy here is broken, Samuel said. They teach these kids how to wear a lab coat, but they don't teach them how to see. I think I'll stay here for a while. Not as a janitor, and not as a ghost. The Admiral studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded, realizing that a man like Samuel Whitmore couldn't be commanded, only convinced. The offer stands, Sam. But if you're going to stay, make sure they realize that the man who cleans the floors might just be the only one who knows how to save their lives. As the Admiral turned to leave, Samuel felt the weight on his shoulders lift. He wasn't a king, and he wasn't a servant. For the first time in a long time, he was just a doctor with a lot of work to do. The sun began to bleed over the Seattle skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the hospital's main lecture hall. It was a room usually filled with the soft rustle of expensive tablet cases and the hushed, arrogant whispers of overachieving residents. Today, however, the silence was absolute. Dr. Eris Thorne sat in the front row, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed on the podium with a mixture of dread and desperate fascination. Behind him sat the nursing staff, the interns, and even the hospital board members. They were all waiting for the professor. The side door opened, and Samuel Whitmore walked in. He wasn't wearing the dark blue coveralls, nor was he wearing the pristine white lab coat that Dr. Victor had offered him. Instead, he wore a simple set of charcoal scrubs, the uniform of a man ready to work. He didn't carry a briefcase or a laptop. He carried a single, battered mop handle he had taken from the janitor's closet. He walked to the center of the stage and laid the mop handle across the mahogany podium. For 6 months, Samuel began, his voice calm and resonant. Most of you looked at me and saw a man with no value. You saw a man whose only contribution to this hospital was the cleanliness of the floor beneath your feet. You ignored my voice because I didn't have a title pinned to my chest. He looked directly at Thorne, who lowered his gaze. Medicine is not a hierarchy of ego, Samuel continued. It is a hierarchy of results. The human body does not care about your board certifications. It does not care about your tenure or which Ivy League school stamped your diploma. It only cares about the hands that are capable of stopping the clock. Samuel turned to the digital whiteboard behind him and wrote a single word in large, bold letters, humility. "This is the first lesson of the new curriculum," he said. "In this theater, the janitor's observation is as vital as the chief's. If the person emptying the trash sees a symptom you missed, you don't silence them. You thank them. Because the moment you believe you are too important to listen is the moment you become a danger to your patients." He announced his new role, lead instructor of the Clinical Excellence Initiative. He wouldn't be taking private patients or doing press circuits. He would be in the trenches, in the ER, and in the OR, teaching them not just how to cut, but how to see. As the lecture ended, the staff stood up, not in a hurried rush to get to coffee, but in a slow, respectful wave of applause. Samuel didn't bow. He simply nodded, picked up the mop handle, and walked toward the exit. In the hallway, he ran into Kevin, the junior janitor. The younger man froze, clutching his cleaning cart as if it were a shield. He looked at Samuel's scrubs, then at his own hands. "Professor," Kevin stammered, his face flushing. I'm sorry. About everything." Samuel stopped and looked at the cart. He reached out and adjusted a bottle of disinfectant that was leaking onto the shelf. "Don't be sorry, Kevin," Samuel said with a ghost of a smile. "Just make sure you do the edges. People always forget the edges, and that's where the real grime hides." Samuel walked away, his stride steady and his mind at peace. He had spent years as a legend and months as a ghost. Now, he was something far more important. He was a man who had found his voice again, reminding a city of healers that true greatness doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs to be right when it matters most. The janitor was gone, and the professor had retired. Samuel Whitmore was simply a doctor again, and for the first time in his life, that was enough.